Oh my goodness, and the fun continues. I got a surprise today. Apparently, I can only do 15-minute recordings. So let's get moving here. So, an atherosclerotic plaque is usually made up of fats and lipids and proteins that line the interior of an artery. One of the things that's interesting is that you'll see these little endothelial cells here kind of budding out. Endothelial cells actually just kind of overlap with each other, and it's not that they're kind of bumping out, it's that the fats get underneath them. And so you end up with these bumps and ridges along the interior of the vessel wall. What this does is it restricts the diameter of blood flow, the diameter of the blood vessel, so blood can't get through easily. And so when you look at a cross section here, here is basically the space that blood can flow through. Now, a red blood cell might be about that size. So what can end up happening is a single red blood cell can start clotting with platelets, and it can completely block the artery. In addition, you could have a blockage that is just full fat or the plaque. So, ew, right? And that'll stop blood from going to whatever area. If this is in coronary circulation on the blood vessels on the surface of the heart, it'll actually starve that section of heart for blood, and that's what will initiate a heart attack. So, how does an angioplasty work? Well, oftentimes the doctors will actually run a line through the femoral artery, all right, because it's a huge artery, and they'll take it to where they see the plaque. And so they take this little segment down, and there's a little balloon inside this little segment. All right, so this is the catheter that brings the balloon down. The balloon is inserted into the atherosclerotic area, and then they puff it up, and that holds the blood vessel open. As time, they let it sit there for a little bit, and yes, it's blocking right now, but they'll remove it, and that keeps the blood vessel open. It basically clears it's like a roto-rooter for blood vessels, right? You. Now, another disorder is an aneurysm. This is where blood vessels become widened near a certain section of an arterial wall. And so if you think about like tires on your car, every now and again when tires get really, really old, you'll see bubbles coming out of the side of the tire because the side of the wall of the tire has become weak. That's an aneurysm basically, except for it's in your tire, not in your blood vessel. So this is basically if you have, let's say, here's a blood vessel and then it's a loose area, right? And what that means is that the blood vessel is weak here, where this loose area is, where this bump is. Sometimes what can happen is this aneurysm can completely burst. The blood vessel comes open, and that'll result in hemorrhaging. If this happens in the brain, that's really bad because that leads to bleeding in the brain. What ends up happening then is after an aneurysm occurs, all right, you can end up with a formation of blood clots initially, actually, inside of the aneurysm. And then as the aneurysm bursts, that can lead to ischemia in the brain or wherever this happens. And that's a bad thing if it's in the brain. If it's in your lungs, you'll end up with an embolism or a hemorrhage in the lungs. That's a bad thing too, right? And so basically, aneurysm is just bad. Is this something that we can control? Not really. Aneurysms are common in certain families. It can be a genetic disorder. So an aneurysm isn't necessarily something that somebody would know that they're predisposed to unless it's been noticed often in the family. Another disorder would be varicose veins. There is a disorder of veins, not arteries anymore. And this slide is actually colored appropriately. Varicose veins are a result of, if you remember what a vein looks like, veins have in the tunica intima one-way valves, right? And then you have the tunica media, the smooth muscle, and blood is transferred from one compartment to the next. That's why these one-way valves exist, so that blood can return slowly under low pressure back to the heart. Well, when these valves fail, okay, you end up with a situation where the valve just kind of leaks, blood starts stacking up. It can't go up evenly. It starts building up inside of the vein, and then what'll end up happening is it distends and distorts the actual vein. And so these varicosities, enlarged veins, are where blood has pooled. And you can see here in this slide that blood is pooled in this part of the leg. Hemorrhoids are varicose veins inside of the rectum. And so what, very uncomfortable from what I understand, the treatment for varicose veins really just involves surgical removal. You can support the veins by wearing tight socks and things like that, but really what you're trying to do is support blood to transition back up the body, back up to the heart, by putting pressure on these blood vessels. Now, thrombophlebitis is, so phlebitis right there, right? So that's where you're dealing with veins, all right? This is inflammation of the veins. That's the phlebitis part, okay? And basically what that means is that you have a blood clot, a thrombus. Thrombus is a blood clot forming inside of veins. And this is really bad if it happens in the blood vessels associated with the lungs, because that leads to pulmonary embolism. So a thrombus in the lungs completely stops blood flow to that region of the lungs. What does it mean that the lungs aren't getting oxygenated anymore? Not necessarily. What it means is that the blood clot is limiting blood flow out to that region of the lung. You decrease the amount of oxygenated blood going back out to the heart, but it really means that the region of the lung may burst and you'll have bleeding inside of the lungs. This is oftentimes a fatal disorder. Here is another example, a nicer example, of what a normal semilunar valve looks like inside of a vein. And this is what a leaky or an incomplete valve in a varicose vein looks like. The vein itself becomes separated. This would be a junction right here. The vein itself is separated already, but the valve becomes separated and blood flows back into each compartment. So now let's just talk about circulation of the blood. Circulation of the blood, we call the plane of circulation, refers to the blood flow from the arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules, then veins. So you can think of circulation as a circular pattern through the body. There are several types of circulation or circuits. There's the systemic circuit that carries blood through the body. So it goes from the left ventricle through the aorta, the smaller arteries, the arterioles, capillaries, venules, vena cava, and then right atrium. The vena cava has two areas depending on if blood's coming from the head. That would be the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, bringing blood back from the lower extremities of the body. Remember that from last week? Remember we talked about tracing the blood flow of a red blood cell? There you go. That's why I had you do it. So this diagram indicates blood flow through the body. It also highlights blood flow through the lungs. So through the body, remember, is systemic. And through the lungs is the pulmonary circulation. There we go. So pulmonary circulation carries blood to and from the lungs. The arteries deliver. Remember, arteries here now are delivering deoxygenated blood. We talked about that at the beginning of lecture. To the lungs for gas exchange to get rid of CO2 and bring oxygen in. The path goes from the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries, the lungs, the pulmonary veins, and then to the left atrium, left ventricle, and out to the body. Now, one that we haven't talked about yet is the hepatic portal circulation. This is a blood route through the liver. This is really important because the liver does a lot of things for us. The liver produces enzymes, it breaks down red blood cells, it detoxifies compounds that we consume, it converts lactic acid into glucose for us to use again. So hepatic portal circulation really is allowing the liver to do what it needs to do. The vein that drains is the hepatic portal vein. There are two capillary beds. The hepatic portal vein exists between two capillary beds. It's a huge vein draining, and it basically helps with blood glucose levels. This is where also the liver has a lot of glycogen in it. It can turn glycogen into glucose and supply your body with new glucose should you need it. And so here are the hepatic veins. Here's the inferior vena cava, bringing blood back up. Liver itself here. Here's the stomach. The hepatic portal circulation, when we talk about hepatic and portal, that's the connection between the digestive system and the liver, because it's super important for the liver to get content from the digestive system. We'll talk about that later, though, when we talk about the digestive system. Here are the pancreatic veins, the splenic vein, and then definitely more vasculature associated with the colon. Fetal circulation is something that only happens during conception and eventually, fetal growth. Basically, this is the circulation that occurs before birth. There are a lot of modifications that allows the fetus to get oxygen and get rid of CO2 as it's growing, and it's getting nutrients from maternal blood. So the unique structures a part of fetal circulation are the placenta, the umbilical arteries and veins, the ductus venosus, the ductus arteriosus, and the foramen ovule, which is in the heart. The fetal heart, I should say. And so here are all the connections showing the circulation of blood flow from the human heart going out to the abdominal aorta. And the reason why it's purple is because you've already lost some gas and blood up to the head. You have a circulation from the common iliac. So here's the iliac arteries, internal iliac arteries, taking blood to the fetal umbilicus. Okay. You have the umbilical cord here. You have the placenta, and then that's going to be connecting to the fetus itself. I'm going to stop here so we can finish up blood pressure in video number 3, since I know this thing isn't going to let me go past 15 minutes.